Well, if you look up Elijah on the internet, you'll frequently find superlatives like boldest and greatest attached to his role as a prophet. But the Elijah we find in this morning's scripture passage hadn't been looking very bold or great lately. Not after having angered Queen Jezebel by putting to death all her prophets who served Baal instead of Yahweh. After hearing news of his deed, she sent word to Elijah saying, "May the gods do whatever they want to me if by this time tomorrow I haven't made your life like the life of one of them." And so out of fear for his life, Elijah made his escape into the desert, where he traveled for a very long time until he eventually arrived at Mount Horeb, also known as the Mountain of God. And it's there that we find him this morning, curled up and tucked away in one of the mountain's caves. And it's there also that Elijah heard God speaking to him, asking, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Clearly, here was not where Elijah was supposed to be. The short answer to such a question would have been running away from Jezebel. But instead, Elijah seems to go on the defensive, saying how passionate he has been for God in the past. Passionate would certainly be one way of describing someone who had mocked another religion and then had hundreds of its leaders put to death. And then he goes on to describe how bad things have gotten in his corner of the world, saying, "The Israelites have abandoned your covenant, they have torn down your altars, and they have murdered your prophets with a sword." All of it true, but not an answer to God's question. And finally, he makes the exaggerated claim that he is the only one left, when in fact, God later points out that there are at least 7,000 faithful Israelites left. So God, deciding that it's time for a face-to-face encounter with Elijah, told him to stand out on the mountain until God had passed by. And so Elijah did what he had been told. And we read that in that moment, Elijah experienced a hurricane-force wind, and then an earthquake, and then a fire. But God wasn't in any of these forces of nature known for their destruction and death-dealing blows on humanity. No, when God appeared, it was in what has been variously translated as a gentle and quiet whisper, a still small voice, and a sound of sheer silence. The Hebrew phrase is difficult to translate, but one Bible scholar feels that the phrase is trying to get across the image of a sudden and empty silence that crushes you into tiny pieces under its weight. That was Elijah's experience of God. And so God says, "Now let's try it again, Elijah. What are you doing here?" And Elijah gives God the very same answer as he had before, word for word. Nothing had changed in his response to God, which seems to indicate nothing had changed in Elijah. Even after a soul-crushing encounter with God, Elijah was unchanged. And so in the words of Will Gaffney, God fired him, or at least announced his retirement, telling Elijah to go back home and, among other things, anoint Elisha to take over as his replacement. Thus ends this portion of a story written more than 2,500 years ago for the people of Israel. And yet, I think it's a story that's relevant for the times in which we live, because we also find ourselves looking for an encounter with God, not only wondering where God is in hurricanes and earthquakes and fires, but also seeking God's presence amidst the disregard of black lives and trans lives and immigrant lives. We are looking for God while politicians seem more concerned with acquiring power than serving the people who have put them in office. We look for God among the rubble of a polluted earth that is crying out for help, and in a global pandemic that claims 1,000 lives per day in our own country. But God isn't in any of these things. Instead, we find God in the soul-crushing silence that seems to engulf our prayers. Desperate prayers to a God who at times seems distant and deaf to our pleas for help. That is, until God's voice pierces the emptiness and asks us, asks the Christian church, what are you doing here? And instead of answering the question, instead of admitting that we don't know what the hell we are doing here, and if we are doing anything at all, we are floundering in a sea of despair of our own making, instead of answering God's question, we revert to our default of recounting the glory days of our past. Like Elijah, we pat ourselves on the back, informing God of our faithfulness and our passion for righteousness. We point out all the good things we have done in the past, often even while ignoring God's question, which asks what we are doing here and now. Churches like to proclaim that the church is not the building, it's the people. And yet when this global pandemic essentially pulls the building out from under the feet of its parishioners, no one seems to know how to function. And if you go online, you will see one worship service after another doing its best to replicate the past. All of them within empty church buildings that have been reduced to backdrops for their live stream video recordings of preachers dressed up in full clerical attire, preaching to empty pews in the hopes that someone is tuning in to their church. And friends, I hear God saying, what are you doing here? The church has been given the opportunity to reinvent ourselves, keeping that which is meaningful and letting go of that which doesn't serve us anymore and probably never did. And what do? We recreate to the best of our ability a worship experience that mirrors a pandemic past. We are being offered a chance to experience God in new ways. And we may still expect to find God in the loud shouts of our hallelujahs, in the booming unison amens of our wordy prayers, and in our pitch-perfect choral anthems. And quite honestly, sometimes we do. Sometimes we do find God in those experiences. But it may come as a surprise when we also discover God in what is oftentimes intimate, painful, and overwhelming silence. A silence that makes us very uncomfortable. One that crushes us beneath its weight, and one which is broken only by the question, what are you doing here? And heaven help us if we reply with the same answer we have always given, recounting and recreating the glory days of our past. I'm afraid God will respond in the same way that God responded to Elijah, who was informed that it was time for him to retire. God is not interested in hearing about our passion or our great deeds of our past. Nor does God congratulate us for doing such a good job of duplicating our pre-pandemic worship experiences in a post-pandemic world. God needs us in the present moment, which looks nothing like former days. It's high time that we quit wandering aimlessly from day to day, bemoaning the bygone days of our past, and doing our best to replicate them. Our response to God's question needs to be that even now we are doing justice, we are seeking out the oppressed and serving them, and we are putting love into action. We don't need a building to do any of that. But we do need to get our head out of our past and step away from our egos, because like it or not, times have changed. We are living in a sea change moment in history. We have been God's prophetic witness in the past, but unless we are open to serving God and not our past, then God will find another prophet. May we each recognize God in the silence that blankets our souls, and may we have an answer ready when God asks, "What are you doing here?" Amen.